А ви вже чули про нові умови позик з Кредос? Кредос – просто, прозоро, без комісії.
The fall in the Russian currency is adding to inflationary pressures in Russia as the country faces further economic turmoil, compounded by the termination of its natural gas transit agreement with Ukraine. Newsweek writes about this and also notes that it would theoretically be possible to take the money and the government could use the Sovereign Wealth Fund. But as I remember, Maxim Blundt, you said that there was nothing there. Welcome our guest, economist Maxim Blundt. Hello. Yes, about the Sovereign Wealth Fund. I realized what the question is there really nothing there? I haven't checked it for a long time, but apparently there really isn't much left there. We have already discussed that there is a very small amount of yuan and some other assets there. Everything else is unlikely to help the Russian government because there are long infrastructure bonds there, which were placed for the construction of railroads, roads, and others. It is clear that no one will sell the roads and the bonds will not be paid off. There are also Sberbank shares there, which, without a decision in principle on full privatization, can hardly be sold. That is, these are illiquid assets. In the liquid part, I repeat, there are yuan, which is already used by the central bank to stabilize the exchange rate, and gold. Американскими долларами, европейскими евро и прочими валютами, которые до войны лежали в Фонде национального благосостояния, потому что российское золото тоже под санкциями. But it is not easy with gold, just like with American dollars, euros, and other currencies that were in the fund before the war. Gold is a little easier to sell than currency, but it is also a complicated process, suitable only for extreme cases. Now, it is crucially important to what extent the new sanctions and the termination of Ukrainian gas transit will hit foreign currency earnings. The Russian government has always been and most likely will be fine with rubles. The only exception was Kiriyenko's government, which failed due to lack of experience and other reasons. However, in general, Russia has always used the opportunity to print money, as Vladimir Putin has repeatedly said. Printing money leads to inflation, but they try to contain it. It is primarily the population that suffers from this. At the end of 2024, which has safely ended, the military industry has already begun to experience difficulties. This is confirmed by the voice of Sergei Chemezov, head of Rostec State Corporation, который благополучно закончился, уже и военная промышленность начала пищать голосом Сергея Чемезова, который, напомню, глава госкорпорации Ростех, where all military enterprises of the Russian Federation are gathered. Военные предприятия, которые принадлежат Российской Федерации. Maxim, which was my question. You could take money from the welfare fund, but there isn't much, if anything, there. All the oil and gas revenues go to the military-industrial complex, and the people are left with nothing, right? Not exactly. What we get from the sale of oil and gas is foreign exchange earnings. It is used to import civilian products and military components that are used to produce weapons. There is a shortage of both. The higher the dollar and euro exchange rate, although the yuan exchange rate is much more important, the less can be bought with this foreign currency proceeds. Accordingly, what happens to the ruble has not been so important for a long time and does not seriously affect the welfare or the ability of companies to produce this or that. It is the foreign currency earnings that are more important. That's why it's important how much currency is left in the National Welfare Fund, not rubles. I repeat, there is not much currency left.
Further, it is necessary to separate foreign trade, which provides consumer demand primarily for durable goods. Under the talk of import substitution, Russia is not doing well, except that they have learned to substitute imported missiles, and not completely. As far as food is concerned, they mostly manage, but as the years of war show, there is always some problem. There is a shortage of leaven for the production of fermented milk products, or seeds for sowing, or roosters for fertilizing hens to lay eggs. That is why there are problems with eggs and so on. That is, even food production depends on imports, despite the 10 years before the war, during which Russia worked purposefully on food security. It turned out that this food security is not 100% ensured. Of course, such factors as the poor harvest of last year have already had an impact, continue to have an impact, and will continue to have an impact, at least until the next harvest. Let me remind you that horticultural products have suffered the most in Russia and have risen in price the most. Potatoes, for example, rose in price by 80% in 2024, which is simply unprecedented. This has never happened before. Cabbage, carrots, tomatoes, cucumbers at the end of the year broke all records in terms of the speed of price rise. Therefore, despite the fact that the government monitors food products very closely and takes measures to keep them from becoming more expensive, they still continue to rise in price. Maxim, where does the foreign currency revenue come from? I understand that this includes the sale of gas, the transit of which through Ukraine was terminated on January 1st, 2025. Now there is a bill in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine on the termination of the Druzhba oil pipeline. How much will this hit us? Foreign exchange earnings, as far as I understand, come from sales through oil pipelines, gas pipelines, as well as from the shadow fleet. First of all, there is also the transit of gas to China through the pipeline. Gazprom is using its capacity to the maximum. There is also Turkish Stream, which should not be forgotten. There is now a serious struggle to lift the restrictions on Gazprom Bank imposed by one of the last packages of the Biden administration. This is necessary to pay for Russian gas exports through Turkish Stream. Some European countries, including Slovakia, Hungary, Austria, and Italy, which receives gas precisely through Turkish Stream, have made requests to the U.S. administration.
То, что я читал, якобы им позволили, но только до марта месяца, а дальше нет. Или я ошибаюсь? До апреля, да.
As far as I know, they were allowed to continue purchases until April, and for some exceptions were introduced until June, in order to finish the heating season and enter the summer with the remaining supplies through these pipes. In addition, there are also exports of grain, fertilizers, coal, industrial, and ferrous metals. You are right. Oil and gas have long and consistently been the main sources of foreign exchange earnings, including for the government. It is not by chance that oil and gas revenues are accounted for separately from other revenues in the Russian budget. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, the idea of introducing a similar scheme for metallurgical products to fill the National Welfare Fund with foreign currency was discussed. However, metallurgists fought back, although they were forced to pay in rubles.
схему для наполнения бюджета, для того, чтобы наполнять там фонд национального благосостояния валютой, именно валютой. Но металлургов тогда отбились, правда, их все равно...
It should be noted that in addition to oil and gas, there are other items that bring Russia foreign exchange earnings.
Есть еще, помимо нефти и газа, ряд...
They are much smaller and less significant. Russia had an illusion that grain would become the new oil, but these hopes were not realized. It failed to destabilize the global food market, despite the threats and fears associated with possible sanctions against Russian grain.
Несмотря на все угрозы и опасения, да, вот эти притворные, а что же будет, если вы введете санкции против нашего зерна?
Will Africa starve? These threats have not worked. Grain has not gone up in price because, unlike oil and gas, if you have oil, you have it, and if you don't have it. Grain, on the other hand, can be grown in the vast expanses of America, Canada, Australia, and other countries. It is not a product that cannot be produced. When talk began that the market would collapse without Russian grain, the situation changed the following year. For example, Europe grew too much grain, which caused problems. Poles, for example, said, "Let's not take grain from Ukraine, but use our own first." The situation with grain is simpler than with oil and gas. New liquefaction facilities are being actively built in the U.S., and many of them are already operating at full capacity. Although the current price increase is not comparable to previous years, gas prices in Europe have still risen after the cessation of Ukrainian transit. I think by summer, this process will exhaust itself and the reverse trend will begin. When it comes to liquefied gas, it turns out that Europe used to buy a lot of it from Russia. However, now they claim that they have found an alternative, for example, in Romania. I have a question. How much money will Russia lose from stopping gas transit? So far, figures from 4.5 to 5 to $6 billion have been quoted. It's a loss. We have already said that the Russian economy is now much less resistant to all sorts of shocks than it was before the war. Therefore, any drop can become the drop that will overflow the glass and provoke another fall of the ruble. After New Year's holidays, when people start to come out of the post-New Year's, let's say, long New Year's journey, which will end for the majority of the population only on January 13th, after the second New Year, it will be possible to begin to assess how the reduction of currency inflows will affect the market.
Вот после этого можно будет начать оценивать, да, каким образом вот это сокращение поступления валюты повлияет на рынок. Потому что мы уже видели по 24 и по 23 году, что самые незначительные колебания...
We have already seen from the 22nd year that the smallest fluctuations, including in oil prices, including those related to sanctions against the shadow fleet, can destabilize the Russian currency. That is, cause a shortage of yuan, a shortage of any currency that is used. Therefore, the first results of stopping Ukrainian transit are likely to be seen in February-March. We will see how oil prices react, but again, we have discussed with you that we cannot say with certainty that oil will definitely get cheaper after Trump gets into the White House. All the talk about Greenland and the Panama Canals and so on doesn't add to the stability, so prices are at least not falling right now.
Они не добавляют стабильности, поэтому цены сейчас как минимум не падают, да, на энергоносители.
You brought up the new sanctions against the shadow fleet. The Biden administration, as it leaves, is threatening to impose some kind of sanctions. And I understand there are already some consequences because China is closing key oil ports in the east of the country to tankers on the United States sanctions list. How much will this hit Russia's oil profits? You know, there's one player in this market that is not afraid of any sanctions, and it is called North Korea. I would not be surprised if some of what used to go directly from Russia to China now goes through North Korea, because it is a regime that really has nothing to lose and is very convenient for all kinds of deals. Russia's friendship with the North Korean regime is one of the factors that said, North Korea is heavily dependent on China and has always cooperated closely with it. It's like Belarus for Russia, and China has North Korea, a cannibalistic regime that scares everyone, but is on a short leash from its senior comrades. So I wouldn't overestimate sanctions because for every new restriction, sooner or later they find ways to get around it, especially since you can corrupt a lot of people. For Russia, the costs are rising, and this rise in costs does not mean that sanctions against the shadow fleet will lead to its complete destruction. It will not drown, of course, but the costs will grow, and at some point their quantity will outgrow their quality. It will simply become unprofitable. Already Gazprom traded at a loss with China, and this led to the government having to drastically reduce the tax time on Gazprom and take on some of the costs of replacing China with Europe. The same could happen with oil.
Санкции против теневого флота и все, да, и теневой флот весь утонет. Он, конечно, не утонет, но издержки будут расти, и в какой-то момент вот это количество дополнительных издержек, оно перерастет в качество, будет просто невыгодно. Да, вот уже «Газпром» торговал себе в убыток с Китаем газом. И кончилось это все тем, что пришлось правительству резко снижать налоговое бремя на «Газпром» и брать на себя часть тех издержек, которые связаны с торговлей.
It is one thing to trade legally and get a clear profit, but it is another thing to trade incomprehensibly when the Ministry of Finance does not know how much the oil companies actually received and what discount they had to give.
Другое дело, вы торгуете непонятно как, и ни Минфин не знает, сколько вы в реальности нефтяные компании получили, какую вынуждены были давать скидку, ни один проверяющий орган.
No auditing body can control this, and accordingly, oil companies do not always show all their revenues, which certainly affects the Russian budget.
Это надо тоже понимать.
Maxim, what does Russia lose from this war? The economy has already lost 1.5 to 1.7 million able-bodied citizens, and by 2045, the labor market may shrink by 7 to 10 million people. How serious is this, and how much will it hit the economy? This is already hitting the economy hard, and this is the most important loss, which is irreparable, a loss that will affect the Russian economy for decades, and not just one decade.
Будет оказывать на российскую экономику влияние в течение десятилетий, причем не одного десятилетия. Да, если вы посмотрите на все демографические ряды, то вы
If you look at all the demographic series, you will see that, for example, the consequences of war are repeated, reproduced after a generation. These demographic pits, like after World War II, are still reproduced because if you have a smaller generation, it gives birth to fewer children. It's all getting worse. The biggest loss, which cannot be compensated for by anything except migrants. Migration policy is a separate issue. We can talk about it. This is the biggest loss for the Russian economy, and it jeopardizes the existence of the entire system, because the loss of able-bodied population is accompanied by accelerated aging of the population.
Это ставит под угрозу вообще существование всей системы, да, потому что потеря трудоспособного населения, она сопровождается ускоренным старением населения. И даже на тех оккупированных территориях, которые Putin начинает...
Even in the occupied territories, which Putin is beginning to consider his own, mostly old people remain to live because women are going somewhere else. And men, for obvious reasons, are either already fighting on the side of Ukraine, or if they remain in the occupied territories, they are immediately taken away and put under the gun from the other side. All these armed militias, armed forces of the DNR, LNR, and so on. This blow, first of all, to the Ukrainian regions that are partially or fully occupied by Russia, as well as to Russian regions, is the worst consequence of the war for the Russian economy.
Есть возможность компенсировать потери экономики за счет бурного развития технологий, да, ну вот они улучшают производительность труда за счет того, что они придумывают там безлюдное производство, строят заводы на которых...
While other countries, such as Japan, China, and so on, which are also facing an aging population, have the opportunity to compensate for economic losses through rapid technological development, improving labor productivity with the help of robots, Russia does not have such an opportunity, because it is engaged in the production of means of destruction rather than robots. It cannot import such products and technologies due to sanctions restrictions. Unfortunately, Putin's regime has simply set Russia back 20 to 30 years at least, making its technological lag irreparable. Countries that are engaged in improving labor productivity and technological transitions, Russia will not be able to catch up in the foreseeable future. Maxim, you say you have set Russia back 20 to 30 years. In such difficult conditions, the Russian economy needs decades to at least reach its previous performance, depending on what it is doing.
Ну, смотря в чем прежних показателей, да, если в России появится возможность импортировать технологии, то есть еще достаточно ресурсов.
If Russia is able to import technologies, there are still resources to exchange them for new technologies. But the problem is that the abolition of technological restrictions is not on the horizon, and the Russian Federation in its current form has repeatedly proved that any strengthening of the country is fraught with problems for its neighbors. They are one of the countries most concerned about global warming, leading in the introduction of renewable energy sources. Therefore, this is the unenviable fate of China's czarist appendage, and it will not last forever.
Эти технологические ограничения, я напомню, они были в отношении Советского Союза, который тоже всем грозился сначала мировой революцией, а потом построением там развитого социализма. Вот и Россия, в отношении России они будут действовать, я боюсь, что десятилетиями. И в какой-то момент и китайцы прекратят поставлять то, что они сейчас поставляют, ну, по той простой причине, что в таком количестве энергоресурсов им будет не нужно. Да, они одна из самых озабоченных глобальным потеплением стран и впереди планеты всей по введению в действие возобновляемых источников энергии. Поэтому вот эта незавидная участь сырьевого придатка Китая, она тоже не навсегда, да, не всегда.
China will not always exchange high-tech products for Russian raw materials. Maxim, I would like to ask you separately about real estate, because Izvestia spoke to influential players in this market in Russia. They say they are very concerned that there will be problems in 2025, that sales will drop by 15%. Some kind of mortgage program As we talked about, mortgages are also being restricted, but still some programs will be in place. Not only will the price of housing collapse by 15% when it is sold, but it will also increase by 5 to 6% because the cost of production, we understand that materials have to be bought somewhere, will also increase. How much of a problem will this be for Russia, specifically for the real estate market? The real estate market is predictable. When rates started to rise, and there was talk of ending the preferential mortgage, builders started complaining that everyone would go under. They were told by the government that they were taking advantage of the mortgage boom. Had to build up your reserves somehow, and if you didn't, it's your own fault. Now it's the fools themselves who will really learn on the Russian market. And a 15% drop in sales is still, in my opinion, a very optimistic scenario. As for the builders, they are in a very unpleasant situation. On the one hand, they cannot sell what they have built, and on the other hand, they cannot reduce prices and give very large discounts because they have taken loans, and their production costs are really high. On the third hand, they cannot keep these apartments on the market indefinitely because they have loans. And to refinance these loans at the current rates is a direct path to a debt hole and bankruptcy. So this situation is now on the verge of exploding, not only in the area of housing lending, but the entire market, including the consumer sector, including people who have taken out loans and now cannot refinance them. So in fact, the current prohibitive rates, if they had been in place for a month and a half, everyone would have balked and waited. But since the central bank made it clear that this was all for a long time, and moreover, these rates were still going up in 2023, by the end of 2023 it was felt that at 16% per annum, the central bank would stop. And that was it.
Было ощущение, что на 16% годовых вот Центральный банк остановится и все, да, ну потому что уже тогда 16% годовых там при 8% инфляции казалось ну, просто запредельно высокой ставкой. Нет, оказалось, что ставки могут быть выше и даже выше 20%, и причем не один месяц. Да, это все создает, опять же, тот самый снежный навес, да,
because even then, 16% per annum at 8% creates the very snow cover. You have snow accumulating in the mountains. Snow is accumulating. You do not know at what moment that snowflake will fall. That will cause an avalanche. There are quite a lot of such snowflakes in the area of foreign trade. And because of the high interest rate, no one knows where it will break through and where the acute phase of the crisis will begin. Everyone realizes that the situation is heating up, and at the end of 2024, they started looking for someone to blame for the consequences of 2025. The consensus is to appoint Elvira Nabiullina as the guilty party. While the avalanche has not started, the situation is holding, but it is alarming. By the way, Maxim, you mentioned the discount rate of 21%. I understand that the government forbade raising it above 23% because they had already forecast 23% at the end of December. But now the rate remains at 21%. How will this be affected if the interest rate is withheld? Look, first of all, nobody can prohibit the central bank from doing anything, not even Vladimir Putin. Although he admitted that Putin met with Nabiullina at the last meeting, where no one doubted that the rate would be raised to 23%. The same week, Putin met with Nabiullina, which he said in his direct line, big press conference. He said that Elvira told him, but so far no one, not even she, knows what the rate will be on Friday. The central bank in Russia is formally independent, and no one can give it instructions. That's why Nabiullina is the perfect candidate for treasury. If she were given direct instructions by Putin, the head of the government, or whoever, he would be in charge. But as it is, the central bank in Russia is independent. As for the fact that the central bank did not raise the interest rate at the last meeting, my version is as follows. At the current level of interest rates, it does not matter whether they are 21, 31%, 51%. No one in his right mind and firm memory will take a loan at such interest rates anyway. So here, in order not to tease the geese, they simply decided to leave the rate at the same level, to see if it would somehow work itself out. But since there are no signs of that dissipation so far, accordingly, the central bank will have to either try to pressurize the Ministry of Finance in some way, that those not so zealously fund, not so quickly fund military spending and other social spending in addition to the military, or somehow will look for excuses for the economy in 2025. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. Have a good day. I remind our viewers that Maxim Blант, economist, was with us. Traditionally, you should do the following. Like this video, comment on your concerns, maybe your requests, and of course, share our conversation. My name is Igor Gavrищак. We will meet you on the air of Channel 24.